super interesting. It reminds me of two things, and I can actually connect this to something else that's on our docket, which is dialectics,
Mm.
and going to be a little out there. So I'll try to make it make sense. But the first part that makes sense is that yes, there's a certain tendency of thinking about machine learning and in general data analytics in the way that it's become more successful and popular in like the last decade or so, um, as if the computational methods are neutral, and then whatever, we don't worry too much about what data we have. As long as we have enough data, this will just be able to answer basically any question. So and the problem, of course, is that the data that you have comes from somewhere. Like the data has a history. It's not just that like you personally, humans have bias, and the bias also influenced both how we like interpret the data later on, and also how we generate the data. But the sources that we have for data themselves are downstream of other theoretical commitments that we already had. And I think a nice example for this is neuroscience. Now, I'm not a like I don't get paid to work on neuroscience, but I'm very interested in it. So uh, I do like kitchen sink philosophy of neuroscience sometimes, and
Best kind.
I'm
Best kind.
really interested in the problem of well, I already mentioned the localization debate, but when I something that sometimes happens is I go to a conference and two people independently recommend the same book. If that happens, that means the book is really good. You have to read it. And the one book that where that happened to me was Michael Anderson's After Phrenology, which is pretty early. It's like 2008, I think, where he did this very broad and systematic analysis of neuroscientific research that localizes specific functions to areas of the brain, and he did this at different levels. So he said, well, there are studies that try to ask what parts of the brain are involved in action or in perception or in memory. And then you can also break those down into smaller parts. You can also, instead of looking at larger regions of the brain, you can look at smaller areas of the brain. And he compared all of these kind of different combinations of scales to see whether any of those can be robustly localized in such a way that you could say, well, this part of the brain does action, but not memory, and this other part does memory but not action. And the result is that in general, every part of the brain that has been identified as being like for X turns out to also be for three or four other things at least. So um, that's interesting, and it's like throws a wrench into the way that we, especially in popular culture, get communicated how neuroscience works in general. It always sounds as if there are different parts of your brain, like little modules that are for doing some specific task. And then there's like an unholy alliance between neural localization and evolutionary psychology, where people then think that um, relatively recent human evolution was structured in such a way that selection pressures would have been able to target individual of these modules such that they could be adaptations for specific things. And then you can get all these uh, weird made up stories about why we behave in certain ways nowadays because our ancestors evolved to do X, Y, and Z. And those are all methodologically untenable, is like the short version. But um, interestingly, this localization research is very old and has made it's interesting because it's based, the part of the complaint is that the kinds of terms we use to talk about psychology are 100 years old. And if you look at psychology papers nowadays, the concepts that we use to distinguish between like beliefs and emotions and other things that are kind of the furniture of the mind that we used to study are super similar to what psychologists did 100 years ago when you compare that to other disciplines where all the concepts from 100 years ago were discarded, and we have new ones because we have new methods for studying it. But those concepts that people use in what's called faculty psychology, they have structured the kind of data that we collected, right? Because when you come up with a study, you have a phenomenon you're interested in, and then you come up with a task that is supposed to involve that specific faculty or capacity, and then you come up with a way to measure something in the brain and so on. But like the kind of data that we generate is structured according to the pre-existing theoretical beliefs that we have about the furniture of the mind, or you could call this the ontology of the mind. Um, And there's a fantastic paper by Joe McCaffrey, and I'm going to tell you the name now in a second, which talks, it gives you like a history of the problems of localization and this like localization debate. It is called Evolving Concepts of Functional Localization. It's a fantastic paper. I highly recommend reading that. And I think it's a great example of how I think science is dialectical. Okay, so now this gets spicy because you start with concepts about the mind, and those concepts are the condition of possibility for a specific kind of research that generates all these results over time. So you have lots of lesion studies and other things. Wait a second, I have some more notes on this here somewhere. Over time, you get more results that are generated by these theoretical presuppositions, right? And then eventually you get enough of those that someone like Michael Anderson can do this large scale analysis and find out that actually the results themselves undermine the presuppositions that made possible the research that collected the data. So at this point, like this connects back to this conversation about how data isn't neutral, but the data was generated in this extremely theory-laden way, and it's like theory-laden over generations of researchers. Um, so we have the findings, and the findings themselves create the kind of contradictions that draw into questions and destabilize the conceptual foundations of the research tradition itself. Um,
Yeah, that's a brilliant point, Elmo. I couldn't agree more. It's really interesting, right? Like when people speak of the philosophy of science, people talk of like something like falsifiability by Popper and all of that. But I think in the true sense, science is really dialectical in the sense that if you think of even how falsification works, yes, you have these presuppositions that a scientist engages in, I mean, you utilizes to engage in a certain scientific endeavor, but then, but it's through it's in some really odd, interesting sense, those presuppositions end up becoming self-defeating as they follow the logic, and that's kind of it's a very dialectical process because it's imminently within the system. The system itself ends up kind of contradicting the system. Like, yeah, being contradictory within the system.
so there are some things I want to point out about this because I was very happy when I realized this is a nice example for how thinking about dialectical science, because I think dialectics is a difficult and interesting concept. And there's a way of thinking about dialectics in science that is less satisfying than this. So the reason why this is satisfying is because we are talking about like in immanent or internal dynamical development of a system that contains contradictions. So it all sounds very dialectical. But the nice part is that this development contains the ideas themselves as well as the objects that we apply the concepts to and so on. So the normal version of how dialectics is supposed to relate to like material reality and science can often um, lack this conceptual or subjective aspect. Now, what do I mean by this? So if you, by dialectics in general, I'm going to mean something that is downstream from Hegel, right? And there's a way of explaining what Hegel means by dialectics that is allegedly wrong. So if you say here, dialectics is a movement where you start with a thesis, then you realize something's wrong about this, and you negate that, you get the antithesis, and then eventually you get a synthesis. People point out that this is actually in Fichte, not in Hegel. He doesn't use those three words. But it's like that can be a first step. So we have this idea that you have a view and then you realize something about it doesn't work that leads to a reaction. You come up with with an opposing view. The opposing view is maybe also doesn't work quite, or it's not stable in some way. It also leads you to realize new things, and then you eventually come to a different position. Now, what I think is important here is that the word aufheben in German, and it has three different meanings. So we say, using this terminology, let's just pretend that it's correct. We would say that this in the synthesis, the thesis and the antithesis are both aufgehoben, which in one sense means conserved. So what are the three senses of aufheben? It means to lift up. It means to lift, as in lifting a ban. So in a sense, it means to get rid of. But it also means to conserve, so to keep something. So it means both to elevate something to a new level potentially, um, to get rid of something and also to keep it, which itself, of course, a little bit contradictory. But why do I think that this evolution of concepts of functional localization is dialectical in this sense? Well, it's because in some way the history of this cognitive ontology that enabled the collection of the data and then enabled these tensions to occur that ultimately lead to the emergence of new concepts like neural reuse, neural degeneracy, neural context. Um, in those new ways of thinking about the brain, this history of neuroscience and the history of these concepts is in a way still contained. And I mean, that's a weird claim that would have to be unpacked in some way. But what happens when you ask someone to explain how dialectics is related to the natural world is that you get, for example, Friedrich Engels's text Dialectics of Nature, where he talks about three laws of dialectics. He says that, okay, I'm paraphrasing the beginning of the second book. He says, dialectics is abstracted from the history of nature and human society. So dialectics is something we abstract from the actual world. So this is part of trying to present it as a materialist rather than idealist philosophical project or method. And the three laws are the law of the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, the law of the interpenetration of opposites, and the law of the negation of the negation. And the first one of those, the transformation of quantity into quality, you could tell the kind of story about, like, for example, when you boil water, right? You have water that is room temperature, it gets 1 degree warmer, that's a change in quantity of temperature, and the quality of the water otherwise doesn't change much. But then when you get to 100 degrees Celsius, suddenly you have a change. The change in quantity turns into a change in quality. So there's a way of telling the story of dialectics as something that happens in nature, but as you notice, there's no interesting interaction between our concept of temperature and our description of the phenomenon. So there's a way of talking about dialectics that kind of stays on the level of the phenomenon. And I think if we want science to be dialectical, it has to roll into one, so to speak, the dynamical development of the phenomena we're studying. And this is often compared to like dynamical systems theory or complexity theory for good reason, because some of these things that happen, quantity turning into quality, are very similar to emergent phenomena. There's also a great example in the Dialectical Biologist about the co-evolution. So I'm going to talk about this in a second. This is cool. But it's unsatisfying to have an account of dialectics that merely deals with the material systems that we're interested in. And if you want to be convinced that that's not a full-throated account of dialectics, you can read Adorno's Introductory Lectures to Dialectics. So I believe that there's an English translation of this. I think Adorno is very difficult to read in his actual books. The transcripts of his lectures are way more readable, so that's nice. And he emphasizes that dialectics um, is something that describes not merely the internal dynamics of phenomena that we study, but also the dynamics of the concepts themselves. So that's I think that's a desideratum for a dialectical science. Now, other book I just held up, The Dialectical Biologist, is a collection of essays by Richard Lewins and Richard Lewontin, and those guys are fantastic in general. But there's in particular one essay called Dialectics and Reductionism in Ecology, where they have an example of dialectics that is predator-prey co-evolution, which is very interesting because you have a predator population, a prey population, and it seems that the population growth of each is opposed to the growth of the other population, or like in contradiction somewhere. Well, at least the growth of the predator population contradicts the growth of the prey population in a sense, you could say, because the more predators you have, the lower the prey population gets. And then if the prey population gets low enough, this has the other effect. So there's like the Lotka-Volterra model for that. But um, what happens if both of these species evolve over time is that the prey gets better at avoiding the predator gets better at hunting the prey. So there's something like medium-term balance that is created by this conflict of opposed tendencies. So if the predators get faster, they evolve to get faster, that would disturb the ecological balance. But the prey also evolves to get better at avoiding the predators, so the ecological balance can be conserved by these two opposing processes in the mid-range, because what also happens during that process is that the conditions of possibility for that process get consumed, which is the capacity for these species to evolve. Like you can't get indefinitely faster if you're a certain kind of animal. You can't get indefinitely better at like hiding in a tree or whatever it is that the prey is doing. So you have this system of opposites that are both contained in like a larger dynamic that preserves itself, but also consumes the possibilities of its own um, existence or process. And that's cool. And it illustrates and like exemplifies many features of dialectics, but I still think that it doesn't really have this um, aspect of rolling the concept into its own development, where Adorno is very explicit that dialectics as the development of a concept in the process of like tarrying with the phenomenon. Like you try to account for the phenomenon by bringing it under the concept, and then it fails in various ways. Some of the ways in which it fails will be um, related to like our actual lives, the way that we like live in the world and use this concept to navigate the phenomenon in our lives as scientists or just as humans. And then the history of this development is in some way contained within the mature form of a concept. So
What do you mean
uh,
by tarrying with the phenomenon?
maybe that's not a great verb. It's just that like there's a way of thinking about how words relate to the world where you might think, well, you have a word and then you have a certain understanding of what the word means. So you have like a concept, rules for how to apply the word. So for example, like does water apply just to H2O, or does water apply in a more pragmatic way to things that I can drink that have a lot of H2O in it and maybe a bunch of other stuff like other isotopes and so on. Um, and so you have these rules for a word, and then you use it, right? You use that word in language and you navigate your environment. So the phenomenon is out there, like whatever, whether we call it water or not, that's part of our life world. And the way that we navigate and interpret and communicate about our life world makes use of the concept. So if we develop a concept, and for thinking about the brain, one thing that is interesting, if we think about how like our concepts about the brain influence how we live our lives, is this Catherine Malabou's "What Should We Do with Our Brain?" I think that's super interesting, and it kind of motivates some of my work on Stirner, as well as the idea that like depending on who tells the story, the dates will be different, but the basic story is that we used to think that the connectome, so the way in which the neurons in our brain are connected to each other, not every neuron is connected to every other neuron. Obviously, some of them have hundreds of connections, or maybe or it might be orders of magnitude off there, but um, we have maybe 80 billion neurons in our brain and more connections than that. And we used to think that by the time you're an adult or maybe 25, most of those connections are established in such a way that they might get stronger or weaker over the rest of your life, but you don't grow new neurons and also not really new connections. So the idea was that there's little neural plasticity. And then some people say this happened in the 70s. There are some other discoveries around the turn of the century that were also influential. But in either case, nowadays we ascribe a way higher degree of neural plasticity to the adult human brain than we used to. And this has effects for how we might think about ourselves. So if you think that adult human neuroplasticity is very low, then you might think that like whatever brain you have when you're 25, that's just what you have to deal with. And like taking on a personal life project of trying to become a different kind of person might be a bad idea if you think that's just not possible. And there are other things you might believe that would be like would mesh well with this notion, like a neural pessimism, you might call it. If you believe in evolutionary psychology and you believe in localization, you would believe that like the different parts of your brain and the different their whatever like their sizes and their ability to solve certain tasks or to react in certain ways are both determined in the distant past by adaptations that happened to your ancestors. And then they are also in a second move, kind of determined by how you grew up. And now you're an adult, and that's just that. And your brain can get worse, but there's little hope for you to develop um, significantly different mental capacities or dispositions or character traits and so on. If you think that your brain is very plastic, that seems more feasible. And um, I think that's a way in which like our concept of the brain can play a role in how we live our lives, right? That's like insofar as the brain is a phenomenon in our lives, it's like an explicit phenomenon for the neuroscientist, but it's also something that is part of our lives, like whether we think about it or not, right?
It's
So
almost like an existential datum, like an existential, you start from, okay, this is what the brain is, and then you go on from there. And it's really interesting, isn't it? You say all this almost like in our culture, just in like the late for like a lay people, let's say, who aren't too interested in on like neuroscience or whatever, they talk of things like the big five personality traits, or what's this, the Myers-Briggs, all these other ways, or even then there's like astrology. It's again this trying to find something to hang on to, trying to find, I'm going to use a Lacanian term here, like a big other, some kind of like structure to hang on to make sense of our experience. Whereas
yeah.
something like what Malibu, for instance, posits, which I'm a huge fan of for sure, is what I would call is more of a ontologically open system where there's like this radical unknowing or like openness to whatever the phenomena of a brain or a subject is.
One thing that I think is interesting about categorization like that is that like if you believe in Myers-Briggs type indicators, for example, there are obviously different ways of interpreting this, but you might think that they reveal something about like who you are as a person, and then this can help you navigate your life if you like behave in such a way that you think you are accommodating some immutable truth about yourself by adjusting your behaviors, while you're actually just enacting uh, like the content of this description. So there's a weird feedback loop, right? Where what you think was merely a description of your psychology that might be either true or false now becomes a guiding principle, and you get something. There's different ways of talking about this. So Ian Hacking called this looping effects. He said that they're what he calls humankind. So like words that we use to describe ourselves have looping effects because, for example, it's very common nowadays to jokingly or seriously talk about yourself as being autistic or having ADHD or self-diagnosing with either of those. I am not like entirely innocent. It's very possible that I may or may not have done that in the past and do that in the future. But um, what Ian Hacking thinks and wrote about, I want to work more on that at some point if I have the time, is that the kinds of labels we use to make sense of our own lives will have feedback effects because they inform the way that we deal with our own lives, situations, and like make plans and strategies for the future and navigate our lives and so on in such a way that our lives can more closely come to resemble the description given by the concept in the beginning. And there's a parallel analysis of scientific models in philosophy of science that uses the term performativity. It's super interesting. I recommend a book by Donald Mackenzie called An Engine, Not a Marketplace, which is about certain models for price developments of financial derivatives. And this is a super interesting question. So, like, imagine you come up with a new financial instrument, you repackage some mortgages or some stocks or whatever in this weird new way, and people are like, you want to sell it to people, and they're like, "What is this? I don't understand how this works. how could I know whether the price is going to go up or down? Well, you need a mathematical formula or model that can predict the price development of this new instrument. And you might think that like predicting the price development is something that is just either true or false. So you might think it's a description of something that just has one criterion, that's accuracy. But actually, what happens is that the mere existence of this model is a condition of possibility for the market, right? People are not going to buy and sell this product unless there is a model that describes its price development. So the mm, model itself that people use to buy and sell it, like the information that the model outputs, actually creates and shapes the market that it's supposed to represent. And that is a very interesting and complex, sometimes complicated feedback loop that they call performativity. There's a nice taxonomy of different kinds of performativity in that book as well. So that's very cool and interesting. But I think it's useful as a more general way to think about the kinds of concepts that we use to make sense of our lives.